Angela Brooks woke up early that morning, the way she always did when her shifts at the hospital ended late the night before. She was a woman who valued routine. Her life had been shaped by structure and order, habits she had carried with her since her years serving overseas. Even though she had returned home months ago, Angela never lost the discipline of rising with the sun, preparing her mind for whatever the day might bring. That day, however, would be unlike any other she had faced. The streets were quiet when she started her drive home. The city was slowly coming to life, but most houses still had their lights off. Angela liked this time of day. The calmness reminded her of mornings on the base, when silence stretched across the field before the sound of orders and movement filled the air. She drove carefully, humming to herself as the radio played softly in the background. She had no idea that within minutes, her life would change in ways she never imagined. As Angela made a turn onto a main road, she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A patrol car was right behind her. She frowned, puzzled. She wasn't speeding? She had stopped fully at the last light and her registration was up to date. Still, she eased her car to the side of the road just as she had been taught to do. Calmly, she rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. She had always believed in being cautious during traffic stops. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their movements sharp and hurried. Angela's stomach tightened a little. Something about their body language seemed tense, as if they were preparing for more than a simple traffic violation. She greeted them politely, her voice steady, but they did not respond with the same calmness. Instead, one of the officers barked questions at her, asking where she was headed, why she had turned so quickly, and if she had been drinking. Angela answered clearly and respectfully. Her voice carried no hesitation. She told them she was on her way home after finishing a long night at work. Despite her cooperation, the tone from the officers grew sharper. They asked her to step out of the vehicle. Angela hesitated for a brief second, confused about why the situation felt more serious than it should. She explained that she would comply, moving slowly so that they could see every action she made. She placed her phone in the cup holder, unbuckled her seatbelt, and began to open the door. In her mind, she kept reminding herself to stay composed. The neighborhood was beginning to stir. A few people across the street peeked through their curtains, curious about why 2 officers were speaking so firmly to a young woman who didn't appear to pose any threat. One neighbor, an older man who often walked his dog around that time, paused on the sidewalk and watched the encounter. He could sense the tension, and his concern grew with every passing second. Angela finally stepped out of the car, her hands visible at all times. She asked in a soft but clear voice what she had done wrong. Instead of receiving a clear answer, she was met with instructions that seemed to overlap. One officer telling her to move toward the back of the car, the other telling her to stay still. The conflicting commands created confusion, not only for Angela but for those watching nearby. She froze, not wanting to make the wrong move. The officers' voices grew louder and the situation became more unsettling. Angela's heart raced, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. Years of military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to measure every action with precision. This moment tested that discipline. She tried again to explain that she had just left work, that she was following their instructions, but her words seemed to fall into the air without being heard. By now, more neighbors had gathered, some pulling out their phones to record. The quiet street had become the center of unwanted attention. A mother, holding her young child's hand, whispered to another neighbor, wondering aloud why the officers were so aggressive toward someone who appeared so cooperative. The scene felt uneasy, the kind of moment where everyone hoped for calm but feared it might break into something no one wanted to witness. Angela remained still, her hands raised slightly in front of her as a sign of compliance. She tried to make eye contact, to remind the officers that she was a human being, someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had spent years serving her country. But in that tense moment, her words and presence seemed to be overshadowed by assumptions that had already been made about her. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became. The flashing lights reflected off nearby windows, painting the houses in red and blue. Every flicker of light seemed to echo the uncertainty of what might happen next. Angela could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, but outwardly she remained composed. Refusing to let fear take control, the officer's stance showed impatience, as if they were waiting for the smallest misstep to justify harsher action. Angela, sensing this, decided to speak again, her tone firm but respectful. She told them she was a law-abiding citizen, that she had nothing to hide, and that she would do everything they asked if they would just give her clear instructions. Her words carried not only truth but also quiet strength. Still, the tension didn't break. The air around them felt heavy with misunderstanding. To the neighbors watching, it was clear that Angela was trying her best to keep the situation calm. Yet the officer's approach only made things worse. The scene had transformed from an ordinary traffic stop into something much larger, something that held the attention of every eye and camera nearby. Angela knew deep down that her life had already changed in that moment. No matter what happened next, this encounter would not fade away like other ordinary days. It had already left an imprint on her, on the neighbors who witnessed it, and soon she suspected it would reach far beyond this quiet street. She could not yet see how wide the circle of this moment would spread, but she knew she had to hold on to her courage, and so she stood there steady and silent, waiting for the next words, the next action, the next shift in this fragile balance. Angela's legs felt weak, but she did not allow them to show it. She remained standing still, her eyes steady, her breathing slow, her hands slightly raised as if reminding everyone that she was no danger. The silence of the street was heavy, filled only with the sound of distant traffic and the faint humming of the patrol car's engine. Neighbors who had gathered were whispering among themselves, their concern growing as each second dragged on. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a radio call came from the officers' belts, startling everyone. The sound broke the silence, but not the tension. Angela kept her composure. She knew moments like this could turn one way or the other. She had lived through tense standoffs before, though never here at home, never in her own neighborhood. She reminded herself, stay calm, stay focused, do not react in fear. When she moved slightly to shift her weight, one of the officers shouted, his hand twitching near his holster. The crowd gasped. A woman across the street let out a cry, and a man recording on his phone muttered under his breath about the unfairness of it all. Angela froze again, lifting her chin just enough to show she had no intention of resisting. Her voice, calm but filled with firmness, carried across the stillness. Please, I am not resisting. I am only trying to understand. The officer's eyes darted to the onlookers and then back to Angela. For a brief second, the younger of the two officers looked uncertain, but his partner's voice stayed sharp as if forcing control of the moment. He barked another command, telling her to kneel. Angela hesitated. She thought of her injuries from overseas, the stiffness in her legs and the unfairness of being asked to lower herself as if she were a criminal. But she also thought of the crowd, the phones capturing every angle, and the importance of surviving this moment. Slowly, she began to lower herself. Her knees touched the ground gently and the crowd murmured, shocked at the sight of a respectful woman being treated in such a humiliating way. A teenager whispered to his friend that she didn't look like someone who had done anything wrong. Another neighbor shook his head, muttering that this was going too far. Angela's breathing grew shallow. Her pride stung, but she reminded herself of something her commanding officer once told her. Sometimes survival is not about the fight, it is about waiting for the right moment. She kept her eyes low, letting the officers feel they had control, even though deep inside, she knew the situation was fragile. And then, as if the tension itself demanded release, chaos broke. One officer's movement startled another. A loud noise erupted, followed by screams from the crowd. The sound was enough to send a shock through Angela's body. She ducked instinctively, her military training taking over. For a split second, she thought her life was ending. But then she realized she was still breathing, still conscious, though her arm burned sharply. The world spun in flashes of red and blue. The neighbors shouted, some crying out for help, others yelling at the officers. Phones shook as people tried to capture every second. The older man with his dog ran toward Angela despite the officers' protests, his voice breaking as he shouted for an ambulance. The sight of her on the ground, clutching her arm, was too much for him to stand by and watch. Angela blinked, her vision blurring. Pain radiated, but she clenched her teeth and stayed alert. She would not allow herself to lose consciousness. She whispered something that only those closest to her could hear. Call the base. Tell them it's Captain Brooks. At first, no one understood. The medic who had just arrived with an ambulance leaned in, asking her to repeat it. Angela's lips trembled as she whispered again, her voice weak but clear enough. Call the base. Captain Angela Brooks. The medic's eyes widened. He glanced at her ID that had fallen from her pocket during the struggle. Sure enough, the card carried not only her name but also her military rank. His hands shook slightly as he relayed the information to the paramedics and, with urgency, picked up his radio. He made a call, not just to the hospital but to the military contact number listed on her card. What happened next surprised everyone. Within minutes, higher authorities were alerted. At first, it was a local base officer, but when they heard the name Captain Brooks, the call was escalated immediately. Angela was not just another veteran, she was a decorated Army officer, recognized for her leadership and bravery in missions overseas. As the ambulance doors closed and Angela was rushed to the hospital, the officers stood stunned, unaware of the chain of events they had just triggered. They tried to explain themselves to their chief over the radio, but their words were shaky, filled with justifications that sounded weak even to their own ears. The crowd, however, was not listening to them. The crowd was focused on the woman who had just been taken away, the woman who, despite her pain, carried herself with dignity. At the hospital, Angela's body trembled, but her mind stayed sharp. She had endured worse before. Lying on the stretcher, she looked at the ceiling lights passing above her and thought about how strange it was that after surviving years abroad, her greatest test came on her own street. She whispered a quiet prayer for strength, not just for herself but for the truth to come out. Meanwhile, the phone calls spread. One reached the office of a senior Army official who knew Angela personally. Shock turned to anger as details trickled in. How could this happen to someone who had risked her life for her country? Within an hour, phone lines were buzzing. Orders were given. Military representatives prepared to step in. Back at the neighborhood, people were still standing in clusters, talking in hushed but intense voices. Some replayed the videos they had captured, shaking their heads at the injustice. Others called news stations, telling them that something serious had happened and that it needed attention. The story was no longer just about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about a decorated officer who had been treated unfairly in front of dozens of witnesses. Angela, lying quietly in the hospital bed, knew that the game had changed. She had felt the weight of that shift the moment she told the medic to call the base. Now it was no longer just her fight. It was a matter that reached far beyond her neighborhood. The Army had been alerted, and with that, the truth would no longer be hidden. Her eyes closed as exhaustion overtook her. She could hear the faint sounds of machines beeping and nurses speaking in calm voices. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to rest, trusting that the message had been delivered. Somewhere, calls were being made, decisions were being formed, and people were preparing to stand by her side. And outside those hospital walls, the world was beginning to shift. The hospital room was dimly lit, the hum of machines filling the silence as Angela rested. Her body was sore, but her mind remained sharp. Every now and then, she opened her eyes and saw the faces of nurses moving around quietly, checking her vitals, making sure she was stable. Angela had always been strong, but lying in that bed, she felt the weight of everything that had just happened. Still, she reminded herself, strength was not just about standing tall. Sometimes, it was about trusting that the truth would find its way out. Outside her room, the hospital staff moved with urgency. Word had spread quickly that the patient they were treating was not just another citizen, but a decorated Army officer. A nurse whispered to another about how unbelievable it was that someone with her background could be caught in such a situation. The medic who had made the phone call earlier replayed Angela's words in his head. "Tell them it's Captain Brooks." He had seen many patients in his career, but never one whose name carried so much weight that a single call stirred high-ranking officials into action. Within hours, the hospital entrance was filled with activity. Cars with government plates arrived one after another. Men and women in crisp uniforms stepped out, their expressions serious. Military police, accompanied by senior officers, walked through the corridors, their presence commanding attention. Doctors and nurses stepped aside respectfully, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The lead officer, Colonel Harrison, moved with purpose. He had known Angela personally during one of her deployments. She had served under his command, and he remembered her as someone who always led with quiet strength. Seeing her name come across his desk in such a troubling context had shaken him deeply. Now, walking through the hospital doors, he was determined to make sure the truth came out. When Colonel Harrison entered Angela's room, she slowly opened her eyes. Recognition flickered between them. Despite her condition, she gave him a small nod, as if to say she was still standing, just not on her feet. He pulled up a chair beside her bed, his voice calm but firm. "Angela, you're safe now. We're here. I promise you this will not be ignored." Angela's lips curved into a faint smile. She did not have the energy to speak much, but her eyes said enough. Relief washed over her. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a sense of security. She had survived the immediate danger, and now people she trusted were stepping in. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, news crews began to arrive. The videos taken by neighbors had already started spreading online, drawing attention from journalists and activists. Headlines appeared on social media within hours. "Local woman injured in confrontation, identified as Army captain." Comments poured in, with people expressing outrage, disbelief, and calls for justice. What had started as a quiet neighborhood incident had now become a national discussion. Back at the police department, tension was thick. The officers involved were being questioned by their supervisors. They tried to explain their actions, insisting they felt threatened. But their words sounded hollow compared to the videos already circulating. Their chief sat with his head in his hands, realizing that this was no ordinary case. The involvement of the Army meant that every step from here on out would be under scrutiny, not just from the public, but from the federal government. At the hospital, Angela underwent further tests. Doctors assured her that her injuries were not life-threatening, though she would need time to recover. But physical healing was only part of the journey. The emotional weight of the incident was heavier. She thought about her years of service, the sacrifices she had made, and the pride she carried in wearing her uniform. To be treated with such disrespect at home felt like a betrayal, yet she also knew that moments like this could spark change if the truth was told clearly. By the next morning, senior Army officials held a press briefing outside the hospital. Cameras flashed as Colonel Harrison spoke firmly to the crowd. He confirmed that Captain Angela Brooks had been injured during an encounter with local law enforcement, and that the Army was closely monitoring the investigation. His words carried authority, but what struck people most was his tone. It was not defensive, nor was it dismissive. It was filled with determination, as if a line had been crossed and could not be ignored. Reporters shouted questions, demanding details, while the crowd behind them cheered in support of Angela. People held signs calling for accountability, while others shared stories of their own encounters with unfair treatment. The incident had become bigger than one woman. It had become a symbol of something deeper, a call for respect, fairness, and reform. Inside her room, Angela watched the briefing on a small television. She listened to Harrison's words and felt a swell of emotion. She had never sought the spotlight. She only wanted to live her life with dignity. But now her name was being spoken across the nation, and she realized her story could be a voice for many others. Later that day, representatives from the Department of Justice arrived to meet with the Army officials. Their presence confirmed what many suspected. This was no longer just a local matter. Federal investigators would now review the case, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and ensuring that every detail was brought to light. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident were contacted. Many of them were eager to share what they had seen, their voices steady with the truth. The older man who had rushed forward with his dog recounted how Angela had remained calm and respectful, following instructions even when they conflicted. The teenager who had filmed everything handed over his video, which showed Angela's composure and the officer's escalating tone. Each testimony built a picture that could not be ignored. The officers involved, once confident in their authority, now found themselves at the center of a storm. Their actions were questioned at every level, and their reputations crumbled as more details emerged. They had not just acted against a citizen, they had acted against someone whose service and integrity were beyond question. As the investigation unfolded, Angela continued to recover. She received letters and messages from people across the country, fellow veterans, community leaders, even strangers who simply wanted to thank her for her strength. Nurses often found her sitting upright, reading those messages with quiet tears in her eyes. She was humbled by the support, though she wished the situation had never happened in the first place. In the evenings, when the hospital grew quiet, Angela would reflect on her journey. She thought of her time overseas, the long nights under foreign skies, the bonds she had formed with her fellow soldiers. Those experiences had shaped her, had given her the resilience to face moments like this. She reminded herself that courage was not only for the battlefield. Sometimes it was for standing tall when injustice tried to bring you down. By the end of the week, it was clear that Angela's case was not going away. National news channels reported updates daily. Public officials made statements, some expressing concern, others calling for immediate reforms. The Army's continued involvement sent a message that could not be ignored. When one of their own was wronged, they would not stand by silently. Angela looked out her hospital window one evening and saw a group of supporters gathered with candles. Their soft glow lit the night, their voices carrying songs of hope and solidarity. She pressed her hand gently against the glass, overwhelmed by the sight. For the first time since that morning on the street, she felt a sense of peace. She realized she was no longer standing alone. An entire movement was standing with her. And in that moment, she knew. The story was no longer just hers. It was bigger, and it was only just beginning. The hospital had become more than a place of healing. It was now a center of attention, a symbol of justice waiting to unfold. Every day, more people gathered outside with signs, candles, and supportive chants. Reporters filled the sidewalks, their cameras ready to capture every statement from officials. The quiet building that once only heard the sound of footsteps and medical carts now echoed with conversations about fairness, truth, and accountability. Inside, Angela sat by the window, her arm still bandaged but her spirit strong. She could see the crowd below, hear their voices rising in unison. Each word gave her strength. She never imagined her name would bring people together like this. She was simply a woman who wanted to live in peace after serving her country. But now she realized her story had become a voice for many who felt unheard. The clash began quietly at first. Local police officials held their own press briefing, standing stiffly in front of cameras. Their spokesperson read from a sheet of paper, claiming the officers had acted according to procedure. He said they believed there was a threat, that their actions were necessary to protect themselves. The words sounded rehearsed, lacking emotion, and the public was not convinced. Videos circulating online told a different story, one of a woman calmly following instructions while the tension grew unnecessarily. Not long after, Army representatives spoke again. This time their words were sharper. Colonel Harrison stood tall, his voice steady but filled with resolve. He reminded everyone that Captain Angela Brooks was not only a citizen, but a decorated officer who had risked her life for her nation. He stated clearly that the Army would not accept vague explanations or empty defenses. "This is not just about one woman," he said firmly. "This is about the values we claim to uphold as a country. Respect, dignity, and fairness cannot be selective." The contrast between the two statements was striking. One tried to defend, the other demanded accountability. People watching on television and online began to take sides, their voices flooding social media. Hashtags with Angela's name trended nationwide. Veterans posted their own experiences, sharing how deeply this incident had hurt them. Community leaders held gatherings, urging people to remain peaceful but strong in their demand for justice. In City Hall, local officials felt the pressure. The mayor held private meetings with the police chief, demanding explanations. The chief argued that his officers needed support, but the mayor knew the public would not accept excuses. Federal investigators had already arrived, and their presence meant the matter was no longer under local control. The Department of Justice issued a statement confirming they were reviewing every detail, and this only deepened the clash. The police union also stepped in, defending the officers, saying they had been under extreme stress, but their words did little to calm the storm. Protesters outside City Hall carried signs reading, "We want truth, not excuses." The people had seen too much to be persuaded by statements that did not match the evidence. Angela's name became the center of speeches and rallies. Teachers spoke to students about courage, pastors mentioned her story in sermons, and families around dinner tables discussed what had happened. It was as if the entire country had paused to reflect on what her experience represented. For many, Angela was not just a woman in a hospital bed, she was a mirror of the struggles faced by countless others. Meanwhile, Angela continued her recovery. Each day she grew stronger. Nurses admired her patience, noticing how she never complained about the pain. Visitors came, friends from the Army, community members, even strangers who had been moved by her story. They brought flowers, letters, and prayers, Angela received them all with quiet gratitude. She never saw herself as a hero, but the way people looked at her now reminded her that she carried something bigger than herself. As the investigation moved forward, new details emerged. Witnesses confirmed Angela had been calm throughout. Video footage showed her following commands even when they conflicted. Experts reviewed the situation and concluded that the officers had mishandled it badly. With each revelation, the pressure on local authorities grew heavier. The police chief, once confident, now looked worn down. His department faced protests, media scrutiny, and federal oversight. He found himself in heated discussions with Army officials who demanded accountability. The clash of authority was visible not just in closed rooms but also in public statements. Each side tried to defend its values, but it was clear who had the nation's sympathy. One evening, Angela was invited to speak briefly on a video call broadcasted to the crowd outside. She appeared on a large screen, her voice soft but clear. She thanked everyone for their support, reminding them to stay peaceful. "I believe in this country," she said, her eyes steady. "I believe in fairness and justice. This is not just about me. It is about making sure no one else has to go through the same." Her words were met with cheers and applause, some people even wiping tears from their eyes. Her short message spread across the country. News stations replayed it, calling her a voice of grace in the middle of conflict. Her calm strength contrasted with the defensive tone of the police department, and that difference only widened the gap between the two authorities. Behind the scenes, meetings continued. Army officials pressed for full accountability, while federal investigators gathered evidence. Local officials tried to protect their department, but it was like holding back a tide. The truth was too strong, the evidence too clear, and the public too determined. The more the police tried to defend themselves, the more they lost trust. The Army's involvement gave the public confidence that the matter would not be swept under the rug. Slowly, even some city officials began to shift, realizing that siding with truth was the only path forward. Angela's presence became symbolic in another way too. People saw in her not just a victim but a leader. She had endured injustice with dignity, and she continued to speak calmly even when emotions ran high. Her military background gave her discipline, but her humanity gave her a connection with ordinary people. She became a bridge between communities, between those who wore uniforms and those who lived ordinary lives. By the end of the second week, the situation reached a boiling point. The Army announced that they would hold joint meetings with federal authorities to ensure justice. Protesters outside the police department grew in number, their voices louder, their chants echoing through the streets. Yet despite the intensity, Angela's reminder to remain peaceful kept things from spiraling out of control. The clash of authorities was no longer just about words, it was about values. On one side stood a department trying to defend its actions, and on the other stood an institution demanding truth and dignity. The world watched as these forces collided, and everyone knew that the outcome would set a precedent for years to come. In her hospital room, Angela watched the news quietly, her heart heavy but hopeful. She knew change did not come easily, but she also knew that once people came together with truth on their side, change was unstoppable. As she closed her eyes that night, she whispered to herself a promise that she would stand strong, not just for her own sake, but for all who looked to her story as a sign of hope. The investigation reached its peak in the weeks following the incident. Every detail was reviewed carefully: witness statements, video recordings, and the officers' own accounts. The federal investigators worked alongside Army representatives, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. For Angela, the process was exhausting but necessary. She knew the truth was on her side, and she understood that patience and persistence would be her greatest tools. Outside the hospital and police stations, the public remained engaged. People held gatherings, shared stories on social media, and voiced their support for Angela and for justice. Her story had become more than a personal struggle. It was now a national conversation. Families discussed it at dinner tables. Students debated it in classrooms, and veterans spoke about it in their communities. Angela's experience had sparked a dialogue about fairness, accountability, and respect, reaching far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The officers involved in the initial confrontation were placed on suspension pending investigation. Their actions were scrutinized from every angle. Experts and legal analysts reviewed their decisions, noting inconsistencies and poor judgment. Slowly but surely, it became clear that the officers' conduct had fallen short of the standards expected in their profession. Public confidence in the local police department wavered, and officials realized that accountability was no longer optional. It was demanded. Angela, despite her injuries, attended meetings and interviews when necessary. She shared her perspective calmly and clearly, focusing not on anger but on facts and fairness. Her professionalism impressed everyone who met her, including journalists and investigators. She spoke about her experience with dignity, emphasizing that her goal was not revenge but ensuring that no one else would face similar treatment. Her words carried weight because they came from someone who had always served with honor, both abroad and at home. As the investigation progressed, officials took action. Officers were formally reprimanded, and some faced legal consequences for their misconduct. Training programs were reviewed and improved, and the department implemented new policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. The involvement of the Army and federal authorities had sent a clear message. When injustice occurs, it will be confronted no matter how high or low the profile of the person affected. The public response remained strong. People continued to rally in support of Angela, recognizing her courage and perseverance. Messages of encouragement poured in from all over the country. Children sent drawings of her in uniform, thanking her for her bravery. Veterans wrote letters expressing admiration for the calm, steady way she handled the situation. Even strangers reached out, sharing how inspired they were by her determination and dignity. Through it all, Angela maintained her focus. She spent her recovery days reflecting on what had happened and thinking about the future. She wanted to ensure that her story was not forgotten and that the changes brought about by her experience would last. She met with community leaders, military officials, and educators to discuss ways to promote understanding, fairness, and accountability in daily life. Her presence and voice became a symbol of hope and resilience. The media continued to cover the story, highlighting not only the misconduct of the officers, but also Angela's courage. News segments showed footage of her calm demeanor during the incident and interviews, where she spoke eloquently about the importance of justice. She was praised for her composure and strength, and her story inspired conversations about reform across the country. Angela also focused on her own personal healing. Physical therapy helped her regain strength, while mental health professionals assisted her in processing the emotional impact of the ordeal. She learned that recovery was not only about the body, but also about finding peace and confidence in the face of trauma. Her Army training had prepared her for challenges, but she discovered that resilience also meant allowing herself to receive support and care. Eventually, Angela returned to her routine, but she did so with a renewed sense of purpose. She resumed her work, continuing to serve her community with dedication and compassion. However, she also took on a new role, mentoring young people, speaking publicly about her experiences, and advocating for fairness and justice. She understood that her story had created opportunities to make a difference beyond her personal life. The city and its residents began to heal as well. The police department implemented reforms, community programs encouraged dialogue and understanding, and trust slowly began to rebuild. Angela's case had shown that accountability was possible, and that change could come when people were courageous enough to demand it. Her experience became a reference point for other communities facing similar challenges, demonstrating that justice could be achieved with persistence, honesty, and dignity. Angela's story also had a lasting impact on the military community. Leaders recognized the importance of standing by service members, not only during deployment but also upon returning home. Policies were strengthened to protect veterans from mistreatment, and efforts were made to bridge understanding between local authorities and military personnel. Angela's courage had sparked changes that reached far beyond her immediate circle. Years later, Angela reflected on the incident with a sense of pride and calm. What had begun as a frightening and unfair confrontation had evolved into a story of resilience, accountability, and transformation. She realized that the ordeal had tested her in ways she could never have anticipated, but it had also shown her the power of truth, patience, and dignity. Her life continued, but the ripple effects of that day persisted, reminding everyone that one person's courage could indeed change the game. Through speeches, interviews, and community events, Angela's experience remained a symbol of hope. She inspired people to stand up for themselves and others, to speak out when injustice occurred, and to believe that change was possible. Her story was not just about a single moment of fear and tension. It was about how integrity, calmness, and perseverance could create a lasting impact, shaping policies, hearts, and minds for the better. And so, what had begun as an ordinary day, interrupted by an extraordinary challenge, ended not in fear but in triumph. Angela Brooks had shown that courage and dignity could overcome injustice. The officer's actions were held accountable, reforms were implemented, and her voice became a source of inspiration nationwide. In the end, the game had changed, not just for Angela, but for everyone who had witnessed, supported, and learned from her remarkable story.